Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Glad to see you back.
Yeah. Did you have lunch? Did you have time to eat?
I had lunch before the 1 o'clock one. How
Ah,
about you?
okay, okay.
I was just gonna do my little comment here. Did you guys have time for a snack, a coffee?
Yeah. We went for lunch.
Oh, nice. Good. Hi, everyone who's just joining us, and welcome. Just gonna put up a little note here so everyone knows what's happening. There we go. Get this all set up here. You're back with your lovely masks. I realize
Yeah.
you probably should have mentioned in the other one why you're all masked up, but it's kind of par for the course here. All right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put this here. Perfect. Great. 3 o'clock, ready to go.
Yeah.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in here. My name is Nicole Burish, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Canada. I'm here as part of House Blend, this series of Instagram live chats that we've been doing, featuring NGC curators and our invited guests. And this week on House Blend, we have an exciting new development. As previously, we've mostly been speaking to folks inside the gallery. Now, and this weekend going forward into the fall, we're going to start chatting with people outside the gallery to kind of do some check-ins and explore the kind of broader art scene across the country and learn about what's happening outside the gallery and all around. So this week, to launch this off, I'm delighted to be connecting with Articule, an artist-run center in Montreal. I'm joined today by Burju Emech, who is the current outreach coordinator at Articule and also an artist. And Articule has in turn also invited Eunice Belidor, who is the former programming coordinator at Articule, and is now the director of FOFA Gallery, also in Montreal. So, hi, welcome.
Hi,
Thanks.
thanks for having us.
Yeah. And as we get started here together in this virtual space, I also want to take a minute to acknowledge that we are nevertheless still existing in real space and on the land. And in my case, I'm grateful to be tuning in here in Ottawa on the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And my guests are joining us, like I said, from Montreal, also known as Tjautjage, and also known as Muniyang, where the Gonyongehage Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and water there. So we're happy to be here with you. A quick housekeeping note, we'll try and chat for about 20 minutes-ish. We may go over if we get rolling, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions. So we'll invite you to post those in the comment section. If you have them, feel free, but we'll sort of gather those up at the end. And yeah, we can get started. Yeah, so I've invited these folks from Articule to talk with me today specifically about an open letter that they published called Moving Beyond Statements of Solidarity. It was an open letter that was sort of addressed to the Artist-Run Center community in Quebec and sort of in relation to some of the solidarity statements that were circulating around Black Lives Matter in galleries and museums, and sort of some of around the actions and movements and attention that was happening there. So, and the letter has this series of questions and resources and steps that organizations can take to talk about systemic racism in meaningful ways and to confront that in their own organizations. So I'd like to just start by asking you guys, why did it feel necessary to publish that letter, and what was the process? How did it come about?
So, of course, I'm just going to speak like from my own perspective as one staff of a larger team. But the letter came from a desire to address what we were noticing to was becoming a bit of a trend by a lot of arts organizations in the city in terms of declarations of solidarity being published without any clear action plans being addressed, without any self-recognition as an organization in terms of harm that may have been caused, without any long-term commitments. And so these statements, some of these statements we were noticing were sort of becoming blanket statements, and were especially coming about organizations who might have been following a bit of like a popular growing support for Black Lives Matters. And so we felt that it was necessary to address our milieu of arts organizations in the city, especially as an artisan center that has had some changes in the last 10 years happen internally to our structure, and to put into writing some of the questions that we were reflecting on that we would hope would be useful for other organizations to potentially start their own reflections with. And at the same time, I do want to acknowledge, like, while I'm really happy that we're talking about the letter that Articule has written, I just want to acknowledge that, like, there has been a lot of positive growth at the center in the last years, but also many challenges that have arisen, and that we are very much still in the process also of asking ourselves those questions. And like, it's a continuous process that's never going to end. And I'm really happy that the letter is being used as a resource, but just to acknowledge that we're still in that work ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I like this idea of the continuous process. I think that's really important to hold on to and to note. So the letter has this amazing series of questions, like you said, that organizations can ask themselves as they think about how they might do this work of being not just not racist, but explicitly anti-racist. And I'm wondering if you might like to pick out and read a couple of those and talk about some of the ones that feel really important to you.
Yeah, well, the question I chose for this was, who have we hired in the past 10 years for both long-term and contractual positions? Are there Black, Indigenous, or people of color in leadership positions? And I picked that question because I was a programming coordinator for 5 years at Articule. And when I was hired, I was not the only person of color on staff, but I was the only Black person. And it became evident at some point during my tenure there, especially in the beginning, that I was hired specifically for my subjectivity. And so it became an issue. And I know that when I was hired, the center was absolutely not ready to host racialized cultural workers, but also racialized artists and Indigenous artists. So yes, the work of hiring had been done, but there is more to the work than just do the hiring, because oftentimes it becomes kind of a revolving door, and the people just don't stay enough because they're really mistreated in their positions. So yeah.
Good question.
Before I pick one of the questions, maybe I'll respond just directly to what you were saying about not racist versus explicitly anti-racist. And I guess like one of the questions I would pull from that I feel like organizations could ask themselves is, what really is the point of like programming racialized artists if as organizations we won't do the best we can to support their life and the thriving of their life? So sometimes I've heard commentary of like, oh, we haven't taken political stances in the past, or we've never engaged in this sort of dialogue. But like not taking a political stance is a stance. And so I think that's where the difference is of like not saying something and being not racist versus using one's platform and using one's place in like the public sphere to be explicitly anti-racist. And then in terms of the questions from the letter, one that really sticks out to me is, who is writing our policies? Do we have procedures in place that accompany these policies? And this I think is really important because, well, policies are such a powerful organizational tool. And they also become sort of like the longevity of an organization. Like they're what's there written in place. And so it's really important, I think, for especially like racialized Black, Indigenous folks to be part of the policy writing process, because it's coming from like a very specific perspective. And then going to the procedures, I think it's so essential, because a lot of organizations often have policies, but no procedures in place, like no how to. So when something happens, there's no guideline for the organization as to how to put policy into place. And this has been like a major point of reflection at Articule, and is something that we're in the process of doing with Camilla Mackerel, consultant, who's working with us, is writing procedures that accompany our policies so that we have a really clear guideline, and that promotes the longevity of those policies being put into place. It also just promotes like skill sharing and knowledge building in terms of like day-to-day resources of how to deal with harassment and microaggressions and aggressions. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and thinking again about that, you could write all the instructions, but if you don't have the tools to act on them or to do things, that's part of the work too, as sort of having tools and skills. And I like what you said about skill sharing in that too, of sort of continuing that. And on that note about kind of human resources, I wanted to Eunice's point, to shout out this nice piece of writing, a resource that Eunice had worked on with Gallery, I think, that were sort of tips about sort of hiring and creating a safe work environment for BIPOC folks, and sort of, yeah, not just doing the hiring, but how are you creating spaces that feel safe and comfortable? What kind of infrastructural changes and policies need to be in place, so that you said people don't just hire and then leave because they don't feel good in those spaces. I think that's we can try and share a link to that one later too, because I thought that document was really fantastic as well. To your point about that sort of hiring process, and maybe on a similar note, the letter also had on this idea sort of procedures and policies and actions. The letter had this list of potential actions that artist-run centers might take, and I would also argue were incredibly pertinent for all arts organizations. And again, part of why I have you here on this platform, because I think a lot of what was in the letter resonates, sort of broadly. There was a lot of these sort of actions that were not only about the kind of outward facing aspects of art spaces, like we might think a lot about programming and publications and promotion, sort of what we see on the outside of an organization, but also about these things like HR policies and staff relations and resource distribution. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this kind of holistic approach.
I'll let you start off with the
Yeah.
Okay. You guys are in busy Montreal. I mean, quite Ottawa.
Lots of construction as usual. So.
Yeah, I have a neighbor who practices like flute every Wednesday at 2:00, and I hear that, but that's what as noisy as it gets.
Wow. Okay, so a holistic approach and why it's so important. I mean, I guess at the basis of it, like if arts organizations, we're putting a priority on our programming being focused on BIPOC artists, so Black, Indigenous people of color artists. If as an arts organization we're doing that in our programming, but we're not putting in the measures and care into the organization itself to welcome these artists and to ensure the safety of these artists, that's a major issue where the programming is not enough. And then secondly, I would say that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought here for a second, that it becomes a matter of like feeding an anti-oppression lens into every aspect of the work, because a lot of the ways that we know of working without us maybe recognizing it are ways of working centered on white supremacy. And so we have to bring in like an explicitly anti-racist lens to relook at everything that we're doing. And there's something that, like Eunice, you said in the French version at 1 o'clock about care that I felt like was so key. If it's only in the programming that we're focusing on diversity and putting to the forefront racialized artists, then we're really thinking of our job as arts organizations being focused on social capital and labor and profiting off of that. Whereas if we put at the forefront care and security and well-being and flourishing of artists and their work, then we'll feed it into every level of our organization. So I felt like that was like such a great way of framing that, and that approach with care is what makes it holistic, is what creates that possibility.
And also, when you invite BIPOC artists in your organization without thinking of the support that you're going to give them, then you're definitely not going to be able to, cater to the new public that they will probably be bringing, because obviously they will bring a public that is different than the one you have usually. But then also, if you're the public that you always get is in a situation where they see BIPOC artists, and then they're the one not showing respect or actually being oppressive, then the institution actually just leaves it because it's out of their hands, because they're not the one being oppressive. So that's also an issue, because they're absolutely not prepared to, make the artist feel safe. So, and also another thing that fits into the holistic approach is something that you mentioned as well earlier, is that, some places have equity and, they have diversity and equity committees to actually deal with issues like that with the employees, but then like the HR committee is not involved in that group. So then when the issue arises and then you have to go to your HR, then they leave it to the diversity committee. So all of the committees should communicate with one another, and all of the values and ideas that the diversity and equity committee is bringing to the table should feed all of the other different committees. So that way everyone can be at the table to make a decision to be in support of the artists or the workers.
Yeah. And like, not to go back to care again, and also safety, like if we were to rename like an inclusion, equity, and diversity committee as a safety committee, it would seem so silly. Like the safety should be at the forefront of every aspect of the organization's operations. But yet when it comes to oppression or racism or other forms of harm, we don't see it as safety. So that's where I feel like a questioning of like programming being diverse or having BIPOC artists present, it's like it's a hypocrisy that just like shows itself when the whole staff or board are all white of an organization. Why can't we also have BIPOC cultural workers and leaders in our arts media? Why is it only within the programming?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, that it's not both in terms of sort of having BIPOC representation, not only in the programming, but also throughout the organization, but also that everyone in the organization is on board with those sort of anti-oppression politics and has done some training and is thinking about how that work happens through that lens. And like you said, Eunice, that also extends to the public. Like we're sort of that institutions are also responsible not only for the staff and their own members and the artists they're bringing in, but do have this relationship to the publics that they're bringing in, how those publics react and interact with artists, who feels welcome coming into this space, because that's it too. You could invite BIPOC artists, but if your usual audience is all white, then that creates a particular dynamic too. So this sort of thinking across the board, and again, not just in your programming, but also in your HR and not just giving all the labor to your, diversity committee, that everyone who works at the organization is responsible for participating and thinking about that and consistently bringing it forward. I think that's that's where that holistic thing comes in.
Yeah. Because oftentimes when BIPOC cultural workers are hired, it is assumed by the rest of the organization that they will be doing that inclusion work, which is what I'm talking in the document that you will be sharing, is that you just can't do that, because then you don't care about your employee. You're only there to, satisfy, funders or how the exterior public sees you. But then at the end of the day, the situation is not going to be resolved if that's how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. And then it does put all that labor onto your presumably sole Black employee to be doing all of that work, when that person was maybe hired to do curating instead, or to do, so you're sort of in the balance of labor, asking people sometimes to do double or triple the work. Yeah, and that creates conditions for burnout, and as we all know, so back to that question of care too, sort of being careful about people's time and energy and labor, I think is important to note. Yeah. That's great. And so maybe to move on to my next question here, there was another really nice passage in the letter that jumped out for me, which was about the fact that this is often really slow work and long-term work. And you talk about kind of, long meetings that go well into the night, and the kind of time it takes to do sort of non-hierarchical, consensus-based decision-making. And that, I thought that was a really nice piece of the letter, and a nice thing to think about, because we think often of artist-run centers as being sort of nimble and responsive and able to move quickly. And I come out of artist-run culture as well, and I'm certainly sort of guilty of sometimes thinking and being like, oh yeah, they're so fast, they can do anything. And then thinking about large institutions as necessarily being sort of more slow moving or bureaucratic. When in fact, I think there's some nuance to tease out there. And I'm wondering how we might think about that balance between a sense of urgency and a need to react to the present moment, and also to do that kind of slow, careful, consistent work.
I think that one of the advantage of responding quickly to a crisis is that you actually get a lot of information from what is happening at the correct moment, and you can actually have, feed a lot of information, because you will get a lot of different, options. But the thing with the long term is that you have to ask yourself the question, 6 months after the crisis or a year after the crisis. You have to be aware and, voluntarily ask yourself the question, are we still doing the work while no one is talking about it, or while it's not trending on social media? And that is something that does take time. So, you can use the urgency to get like your talking points, and then this is what you're going to work on throughout, because your programming takes a long time, hiring takes a long time. But whenever you do those things, you still need to ask yourself all of the burning questions that arise when you were in the crisis period.
And also, like, even just thinking about what is a crisis and what is not a crisis is kind of interesting, because it's like, for like racialized artists and cultural workers, especially Black and Indigenous folks, it's not crisis and then crisis ends. It's an ongoing reality. So it's just day-to-day like violence that is lived with. And so to even think of like a crisis versus not a crisis, I think is kind of like a bit of a privileged actually perspective of like maybe folks who have never been confronted with this, with racism or with the reality of living with like violence on a day-to-day base, who suddenly like are like, oh, this is a crisis moment and need to have some changes put into place. But for a lot of racialized folks, it's like their day-to-day lives is trying to keep safe. So I think like crisis in an organization can be a great impetus for getting some getting the ball rolling in terms of reflection, but the key is like longevity and consistent dedication. And unfortunately, like our milieu is set up to not put that at the forefront, because often we're lacking time and we're like lacking resources, which can easily be used as an excuse to not put these questions at the forefront of everything that we do. And it might just mean that we need to cut back. It might just mean that we need to like slow down our programming, stop doing so much so that we can actually look critically at how we work together and how we take care of each other, so that we can actually give time to that without burning each other out and without that being an afterthought, but actually like at the forefront of everything that we do. There's an artist that we're working with at Articule named Camilla Mackerel, who I like always remember a quote that, or like a thing that they share with us, which is the learning and listening and self-reflection that happens outside of moments of crisis is so different from the learning and reflection that happens during moments of crisis. And it's really worthwhile to, and it needs to be an ongoing commitment. Yeah.
Yeah. I like what you're saying about this. Yeah, like the sort of using scarcity or using the sort of lack of resources as an excuse. And I think, yeah, in this milieu, we're often conditioned to think about, oh, I don't have time, or, oh, I don't have resources. But the need to kind of prioritize or shift where the resources are going, that's still possible at a small scale. And it's certainly possible at a large scale as well. And thinking about how that tendency, which, you know, we're all sort of pushed to do more with less. Like we're constantly doing more with less and more with less. And so what does it look like to say, okay, time out, here's what's important. What if we do one less show this year and we do spend some time and resources on doing anti-oppression training, or on doing reflection, or on doing whatever that looks like. I think that's yeah, slowing down again as a way of taking that care and taking that time. And being hugely important. And like you both said, of doing it again and again and again. It's not a kind of one and done piece of work. It's to sort of revisit those questions and to be doing that work consistently. I think that's, yeah, I'm glad to hear that as well. There was another thing that I really loved about the letter, and I mean, I think we're already kind of doing this, is the way that the letter cited the labor and efforts of all the sort of people around and at Articule, especially the Black and Indigenous and people of color who've been involved before, in queer and trans folks, and whether that was as staff or volunteers or members, sort of this broader community, who had sort of done the work to pave the way for this letter to happen. And it also had, you know, tons and tons, it has tons and tons of links and lists of other resources. So perhaps you could talk a bit about why it was important to do that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'll respond. I'm sure I'll have a lot to say.
Well, I guess like citing all those resources is just a way of, well, is one way of like amplifying and supporting already the tremendous amount of work that exists and the tremendous amount of resources that like already exist. And so just really making it clear how accessible this information is, and it's at our fingertips. We just have to have the initiative to go and seek it out. Secondly, also, it's just like a form of respect to recognize like on whose shoulders the organization, and you could say even the letter, stands on. It's been over 10 years of like various members and staff and board members and volunteers who have like, yeah, dedicated themselves to like making some of these changes happen. And then also I would say like it's a way of like solidarity building to like make your citations known and to what's homage in English? Oh my gosh.
Honor?
Honor, yeah. To honor all these people whose like wisdom and work you have followed or that you've learned from. And it's a way of just, yeah, like creating a network of solidarity, I think.
Yeah, when Articule wrote the letter, I received it by email before it was published, and it was sent to other racialized staff and past board members. And I really appreciated that article did that, because it actually recognizes that a lot of these board members were instrumental in creating the change for those staff to be able to work in a safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear that it was not an answer like, okay, we see there's a lot of things happening, so we're just going to answer. It was a legitimate feeling of, showing that this work was being done before the letter. So I think that was a very beautiful gesture, and it was a good way to make us feel included, and not just, we're not just there after the fact, So I really appreciated receiving that letter and being able to give feedback, and yeah.
That's great. Well, and that's, I think, often happens in those spaces. You work in a space for a long time and then you leave, but your impact is probably still there, and you probably still do have connections. So I've recognized
that was nice. I when the letter was published, they sent me messages saying that I was really instrumental in a lot of the changes that happened, because I have been doing the programming for the last 5 years, and that was really moving, because you never know when you do the job, and no one really recognizes anybody working in the arts. We don't have awards, we don't have anything like that. Mm-hmm. So I really felt like, if this is the impact that my programming has done, then I'm just blessed to be recognized for that. I was really happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. It also made me think too about this sort of in larger institutions, or maybe in institutions that are just sort of starting to do this work, there's this tendency to sort of think, oh, we need to reflect, or we need to think about what we're doing. But also, I think past that, like there are so many resources out there, and people this is not new work. This is work that's been going on for a long time. And there's no lack of information out there. So that sort of, that need for individuals, but also institutions to take responsibility to sort of look for those resources and do that research and sort of continue seeking that out. I think your letter also points to that as well. And there's also this sort of beautiful, generous compilation of those sources in one place that I think is really, really, like you said, about kind of solidarity building as well.
Yeah. I also wanted to just add like that it's also a way of like recognizing the labor, and like erasure of labor, especially erasure of like Black and Indigenous and racialized folks' labor is like can be a form of violence in itself. And so the citation is like, as much as it is, I said earlier, like an honor, it's also just a form of like recognizing that work, which is so important, and like an important detail that can't be let go of when when like talking about, I think, anti-oppression.
Mm-hmm. Giving credit. So, yeah. Well, we're getting close to 3:30 here, so if people have any questions, I would invite you to post those in the comments. We did have one question go by early in the discussion asking where people can see the letter, and I think generous spectators have already replied that it can be found on Articule's website. Sorry, I've got some motorcycle in the background here. And I'll make sure and post the link to the website in the letter in the comments afterwards, so people can find that there. But it's pretty front and center on the front page of Articule's website. I also was wondering, in the French conversation, we had something come up about the basis of base d'unité, a basis of unity. And I'm wondering if you might want to speak about that for a second, because I thought that was it's a nice piece that kind of goes with the letter in terms of how Articule is working.
So the basis of unity is a form of like coming into an agreed list of values. And so it was written by our members and staff like in the last 5-6 years. It's been an ongoing process. And it was adopted by membership in March 2018, and essentially it's a list of values that are rooted in anti-oppression that we agree as a center to commit ourselves to. And there's a really great little document by COCO, the Center for Community Organizations, that talks about like an effective base of unity. But the goals of it is really just to guide the directions of the center, and for it to be a living document. So for it to express like values at large that we can then, as staff and members and volunteers, put into practice by making decisions. So you could say it's almost like our living mandate or our mission statement, and it exists physically in the space. And we give it to all the new staff, all members, everybody that engages the center as almost like a mutual agreement. Like, this is where we're coming together. This is at which point we're coming together. And it allows, I would say, the staff especially to have a bit of a guiding document that we can make decisions on if we feel that something is inappropriate or harmful or violent. So it helps, yeah, it helps to like guide our actions. It was a really great first step as an organizational document for Articule to create that and have it adopted. So yeah, that's like a really clear, like living written text that I think could be useful for other organizations to think about.
Yeah, I like that. And sort of when I was looking at some of the letters and statements that were coming out in June and these sorts of things, noticing too, like that some centers doing statements, but other ones taking this time to kind of craft a document that would continuously guide them moving forward. And again, in this sort of more holistic way about principles that would be useful, not just in this moment, but also going forward. And like you said, to kind of gather a group of people around a set of shared values. I think there's something really important and fantastic about being able to articulate that and to share with people coming in, like, here's how we work. If you want to come here, here's what we do. Yeah, definitely. I have one little question or comment that says, I hope this will be saved. And yes, it will. Don't worry. We publish all of these on the gallery's Instagram IGTV channel, and I think they also go on YouTube. So this will be available afterwards as well.
I have a question for you, Nicole. Because I mean, it's a great initiative that like we can have this discussion between the NGC and SQ, and I wonder, will this discussion like be carried forward at all to the National Gallery, and in which ways? Because I think, you know, we're like talking to organizations with one another, and of course I want to like ask about how are these reflections being brought into the NGC in terms of your history and legacy as an institution.
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's yeah, I mean, this is this sort of, you know, online chats that we're doing, but we are certainly having a lot of conversations right now as an organization. I think like most organizations are. And, you know, Eunice had asked a nice question in the French version too about, you know, the representation of BIPOC folks in positions of power and leadership at the gallery. And I think anyone paying attention or looking, it's pretty clear to see that there's work that needs to happen there. There was an article in Canadian Art that really detailed the kind of whiteness of leadership in Canadian arts institutions, and the National Gallery is no exception. Yeah, so I'm bringing, I think what I've been trying a lot to do is to reach out to people I know who are already doing this really good work, like you guys are, and to try and bring that into my space at the gallery, and to share documents like the one Eunice had written about sort of hiring practices. We're sharing articles. Yeah, and I also work with this. There's a prize that the gallery had launched last year, the Lacey Prize, which was sort of to recognize work that's happening in artist-run centers across the country. And that's been really important to me too. I think in terms of, again, acknowledging that we're connected, like we are all existing in this kind of art ecology together. And it's really important, in my mind, for larger institutions to be not just looking at smaller institutions, but like actively listening and sort of inviting these kinds of relationships. So it's my hope, sorry, that was a very meandering answer about a lot of different things. It's my hope that these conversations keep going, And it's my practice and my intention as a curator to continue to be connected to artist-run culture. I find that to be a really inspiring and vital source of information and knowledge and research. So for me, that's important, and that's something that I certainly bring into my work at the gallery, and something that I continue to push for there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We have a question coming up that says, what are some of the ways that BIPOC cultural workers who are speaking up and demanding anti-racist work within their organizations can protect themselves in the process?
Wow, that's a good question. So I will speak by experience because when I worked at articule, there was an issue where we had to address anti-Black racism specifically and oppression towards BIPOC staff. And, you know, speaking up put us in an immense amount of danger, and we just never, I mean, now we can both write in our CV that we work tremendously under traumatic experiences, but I still haven't figured out the answer to that question. I know that right now, because I work in a university, there is the university system that I can use to protect myself because, you know, they have bylaws and a lot of things that I can use for that. But in an artist-run center, I wish I could find an answer, or maybe there's an answer now because the work is being done there, but there was no way for us to be protected. So I'm really hoping that someone will get the answer and, you know, help the others, but that's an incredible question.
Yeah, and it kind of relates actually to, there's another comment there in the fee talking about buddies in bad times, and a BIPOC artist who has taken on in the last month calling in this theater company in Toronto for harm that they have lived through, has also just heard from like tons of other BIPOC artists who have also been harmed by this organization. And this individual, and it's public information, or it's posted publicly, so I think it's okay to talk about, is currently facing a lot of pressure in terms of having spoken up, and a lot of repercussions for that. And unfortunately, if the individual is no longer, like once you're out of an organization or you've been pushed out, you have no protection. You have nothing. So many artists are also like not unionized. We have like nothing to protect our work and our labor. And public or popular support is wonderful, but after a certain end of the day, the responsibility is often still placed on like the individual to have to find a way to protect themselves, especially if it becomes a legal matter. So I don't know, it's such a... and
I understand why this question was asked by this wonderful person, but I think it will take a long time for us to be able to find an answer to that. But right now, as we speak, and even when you look at the government of Quebec specifically, because that's where we are, just the fact that they don't recognize systemic racism and all of that makes it even easier to target the people who are speaking up. So I just don't know.
Yeah, I think that those, we have some more comments about that specific case in Toronto. But and jump in if I'm not getting this right, but I think partly what I'm hearing is that sometimes it's like the very fact of labor and working conditions in artist-run centers, and I would again argue the art world at large, set up conditions that sort of perpetuate harm and violence, and whether that is of lower paid jobs, of sort of unclear HR processes, of staff and board relationships that aren't often as sort of clear or what's the word I'm looking for? But yeah, aren't as, you know, again, back to the sort of policies and procedures piece, Eunice, when you're saying in the university, there is at least a clear procedure for if you wanted to file a complaint, where in smaller organizations, not all of them, that, but sometimes that isn't the case. So there's a piece here, I think, that is around kind of thinking about labor rights and organizing and advocating for better working conditions in the arts generally. that I know is not it's not the fix all piece, but I think there's something there around how, again, when back to this question of care, how we care for each other and how we care for the people working in our sector, and again, compensating people properly and having clear procedures is sort of the unglamorous part of the work we do, but is so important to kind of build those structures too.
Mm-hmm. I also just want to say there's a lot of comments specific to this case in Toronto, and I just encourage people to read it because there's maybe more information than what I have shared, or more detailed information. But I mean, I don't know if we have time to go a little bit further here, Nicole, but what you're bringing up just makes me think so much of, well, there was like a community discussion around abuse of power two, 3 weeks ago between a few artist-run centers in Quebec, in Montreal. And we talked a lot about HR and how human resources in artist-run centers or in small arts organizations are often board members, or often a really small team that don't have HR experience. Mm-hmm. But also there's a lot of conflict. There can be issues of power abuse because you have board members who are taking on the HR. So it can, it can become really complicated. So just the need for like strong human resources in our like small arts or large arts organizations, but especially in small arts centers, is such a big need. We really, it's like a really important thing that I think is sometimes just sort of, we don't have the skill sets always to prioritize that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because oftentimes, especially in artist-run centers, your board has to be a majority of artists. And personally, I don't know a lot of artists who also have HR training. And, we do the best we can to make sure that we do the work we do, but then we're lacking in other parts of the organization. So then, when you talk about what should be the priority or how should you think about how you manage your institution, then maybe at some point you will have to make all of the efforts in the HR, and then eventually that will just help everything else.
Yeah, there is something there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, we're in that it's the unglamorous part of arts administration, but I think it's so fundamentally important because you're talking about people's livelihoods, and you're also talking about an industry where I think we're often told that we're so lucky to have jobs in the arts, where there's a sort of narrative around scarcity that can reinforce some of those tendencies towards abusive power, or of people just keeping silent because they want to keep their jobs. We have one other question coming in. People are loving this HR conversation. Let's keep going. It asks, would you suggest having an HR department or committee that is unconnected to another organizational committee? Or it sounds like I'm sort of asking if that should be separate or outside the organization.
Personally, I think that the HR committee should always have someone external that knows HR. That is not an artist and that is there. They could be ex officio, they don't have to vote, but they have the resources to help in terms of HR. So I think that we should, as Artist-Run Center, we should be able to expand boards or committees with what we need to have. For instance, like financial or fundraising committees, oftentimes they're the least popular, but why don't we get someone who just does that and they can advise and they can be there for the fundraising? When it's about money, it's always easy to find a solution, but then when it's about HR, nobody knows what to do.
Yeah. Something that we're in the midst of developing with CAMA is a conflict resolution and complaints procedure where the actual committee is not staff nor board members. We are hoping to have a couple board members in there to be able to give them the resources, but it would be an external committee that would be elected at our general assemblies, and that would pool, we would essentially provide them with training to put into place the conflict resolution or complaints procedure. But I think some sort of a coalition or collective complaints and conflict resolution procedure that many artist-run centers share, that could then, or many other organizations with similar mandates share, could provide this how-to and then could act as an external committee for different organizations. And you could, that way you'd have tons of people in the committee that if there's a conflict of interest, if there's an abuse of power, you have folks who are not directly attached to the center to be able to work together.
Like a kind of separate body that a number of centers could kind of put together that would be external to all of them.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Or be made up of different members of the various centers, but would be a mix of members from different organizations.
Yeah, a neat idea. I also, I like this piece about training as well, that's always, that training around HR, but also training around conflict and conflict management. I think that's something I kind of keep coming back to. And also I was, in my experience working in artist-run centers, I did a lot of research too, looking at sort of the broader nonprofit sector, because I think also artist-run centers we sort of stay in the arts community, but there are resources outside of, sort of in that broader nonprofit sector for things like HR and conflict, and that there's sort of to remember that there's this kind of bigger ecosystem too with other organizations that might share similar challenges and issues around resources or ways of working that could be similar. I think that's a place I like to look also when I'm sort of thinking about these kind of infrastructural questions.
Yeah.
This is great. We're having a fabulous brainstorming about how to solve all the problems. That's great. We're getting some more comments of people sort of saying similar things. It's a great idea. They like this external HR committee. Are there any other questions? Do you guys have any questions for me?
No, you answered my earlier question earlier during this talk. So about the structure of the NGC and the hiring of BIPOC. So I'm good.
Yeah. I mean, we can reiterate it. It was such a good question that I'm sorry I jumped ahead and asked you.
Yeah, that's the thing, but we talked twice in the same day.
The fun of the bilingual question. But it was a very good question about the kind of representation of Black and Indigenous folks at the National Gallery. And like I said, it's an area that needs work, and the gallery is going to be working with a consultant on anti-racism training going forward. But yeah, also, I guess to kind of reiterate, I think sometimes a lot of that work happens for us in our collection. We have an Indigenous art department. We collect a lot of contemporary art by Black and Indigenous artists. But again, that's that outward facing piece. And so I like that our conversation today has really brought up these kind of infrastructural questions around the inner workings of an organization, and that's such an important site for that work to be happening, that it can't just be the outside, it has to be on the inside too, and it has to be ongoing. So,
and I think an important question that every centers or galleries or any art institution should ask themselves before doing this work is why are they actually doing the work? Because if it's just because they'll get more funding money, then you know what, maybe you should just sit that one out. Yeah. So I think answering why you're doing that work is key before even starting.
Yeah,
totally. And it goes back to earlier in the discussion when we were saying why just programming marginalized artists is not enough, because then it ends there. You ask yourself why, and the answer might be likely to get more funding or to raise our social capital or to have more visitors or ticket sales. Well, then don't do it.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate, I think there's so much of this conversation that, I know it started with letters to artist-run centers, but that I just think is so relevant to the rest of the art world and, the world more broadly. I think also shows the extent to which arts organizations have a role to play clearly in anti-racist work and in sort of political work too, which I believe very much. So I want to thank you guys so much for doing this with me today, and for your time and your knowledge and your energy. It's been a total pleasure chatting with you. And I do hope we can keep talking.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Thanks for reaching out, Nicole, and for having us.
Yeah, and I hope I'll be in Montreal soon again, sometime to visit. There. Yeah. And thanks everyone else for everyone else who tuned in and asked questions. And like I said, we'll be posting this on the gallery's Instagram account and sharing some links as well. And oh yes, and I'm supposed to remind everyone that there is a Zoom event happening in relation to Abedakwane, where Christine Lalonde and Jamie Morse will be chatting with some of the artists from Abedakwane, and that's this Saturday, August 29th from 1 to 2 p.m. And you can register on the gallery's website if you'd like to join there. So thanks everyone so much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.